Okay, welcome everyone. I have 6 o'clock, so let's get started. Welcome, I'm Jeff Kinder. I'm the host of Policy Crunch and Executive Director for Science and Innovation here at IOG. The Institute on Governance is a not-for-profit think tank here in Ottawa, and you can learn more about what we do on our website at iog.ca. Policy Crunch is our monthly speaker series where we explore issues of disruption and convergence in public policy and governance. Tonight's topic is energy transition. Does a sweet spot exist? And we have a stellar lineup of speakers. Before we go further, I would like to acknowledge that at least those of us in Ottawa are convening on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I also want to acknowledge our sponsor, Bell Canada. We're very grateful for their support of this season of the Policy Crunch series. So just a word to explain how the session will play out this evening. We have a large group of participants here in the Zoom, and we are also live streaming to IOG's YouTube channel. This is just our second ever virtual Policy Crunch, so hopefully the technology will continue to cooperate with us, but if not, please bear with us. In a minute, I'll introduce our moderator, who will introduce the panelists. Each of them will provide brief opening remarks and then take questions, initially from the moderator and then from the audience. If you have a question, please enter it in the chat function, or you can tweet it with the hashtag #PolicyCrunch. At 7 p.m., then we'll draw the formal part of the discussion to a close, but we encourage those of you on Zoom to select a breakout room for an additional opportunity to ask questions of the speakers. We'll do that for about 30 minutes, and then we'll wrap up not later than 7:30 this evening. At this point, it's my pleasure to introduce David Murchison, who will serve as moderator this evening. David is our Senior Vice President International, and he has assembled a great panel to crunch the topic of energy transition. David, over to you.
Thank you, Jeff. So my name is David Murchison from the Institute on Governance. And as Jeff mentioned, I head up the international business at IOG. So I have two roles tonight. First, to introduce our speakers, and second, to moderate your questions. Before the individual introductions, let me say that we have a really terrific panel. Jeff's mentioned this, but each of our speakers could easily carry the night on their own. However, we're forcing them to crunch it down and share the stage. We have tonight Sarraj Dupont, Scott Vaughan, and Dr. Monica Gattinger. And that will be their order of speaking. Each will speak, as Jeff mentioned, for 5 to 7 minutes, after which we will open up for questions. You should have each of the speakers' biographies, and so let me just highlight some things rather than read each out. Let me then introduce our first speaker, Sarraj Dupont. Sarraj is a former senior executive from Canada's Public Service and now a senior advisor at Bennett Jones, one of Canada's largest law firms. In the public service, Sarraj was deputy clerk of PCO and DMIGA. He was Canada's ED at the IMF, and he spent the longest part of his career at Finance Canada. Perhaps of particular interest for us tonight and this topic, he was a senior advisor to PCO for the TMX pipeline project that was approved about a year ago. Sarraj was also the DM of Natural Resources Canada from 2010 to 2014, where he would have spent considerable time on energy issues and pipeline capacity issues specifically. Welcome, Sarraj. Our second speaker tonight is Scott Vaughan. Scott was president and CEO of the International Institute for Sustainable Development from 2013 to 2018. I hope I have those dates right, Scott, because I see it wasn't in your bio, actually. And IISD is one of Canada's premier think tanks that seeks to find solutions to transition economies to be more sustainable. IISD, if you don't know it, is headquartered in Winnipeg. Prior to that, from 2008 to 2013, Scott served as Canada's Federal Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development, which I think is in the Office of the Auditor General of Canada. Here he reported on how well the federal government is managing its environmental and sustainable development commitments. Looking at the dates, that would have been a challenging period of time. He has worked internationally at the UN Environment, at the Organization of American States, and the WTO. Scott is currently a chief advisor to the China Council for International Cooperation on Environment and Development and continues as a senior fellow at IISD. Welcome, Scott. Our third and final speaker tonight is Dr. Monica Gattinger. Monica is a professor at the School of Political Studies at U of O and the director, Institute for Science, Society, and Policy. She's also chair of Positive Energy, which may be of interest for most of you, and especially tonight, given the topic. This project brings together energy leaders and academics to decide on how to strengthen public confidence in energy decision-making. Positive Energy has a terrific series of papers that I would encourage you to look at if you haven't. Monica has been recognized for her thought leadership in the energy sector with the 2020 Clean 50 Award, and she sits on a number of important advisory boards, including one at IOG, and is a sought-after speaker. A very warm welcome to you as well, Monica. So with that, I think we kick it off, and I think Sarraj, if I have the right programming, you're going to lead off.
So you do, and I managed to find the unmute button, so I think I'm good.
Great.
Okay, well, listen, I'm really happy to have this opportunity to resolve an existential question that has frustrated Canada for the last 10 years at least, and I have about 7 minutes to do that. So I think folks may forgive me if my answer is only very partial. First, some comments on the current context, including the impacts of COVID-19. In 2019, Canada's net energy exports were $76 billion. That's including $62 billion of crude oil. That was enough to pay for our net imports of consumer goods and motor vehicles and parts, net, right? With this contribution from the energy sector, unmatched by any other sector of our economy, our current account deficit in 2019 was kept at about $45 billion. Still significant, but much lower than it would have been. Now, this deficit every year must be mirrored as a matter of Economics 101 by a surplus in the capital account of the balance of payments. Canada must import capital in the form of FDI or portfolio investment in our equity or our debt to offset the current account. David Murchison spent a couple of years of his career going around trying to get that kind of investment. Now, the sharp drop in the oil price since the outbreak of the pandemic means we will not have the same contribution from the energy sector to our merchandise trade in 2020 or until prices firm up. Our current account deficit will likely rise, with our governments, households, and firms going deeper into debt to get through the crisis. We likely will become more, not less, reliant on foreign capital. Now, if confidence in our economy wanes, we will need to pay more for that capital through higher interest rates. Debt service costs for governments and all borrowers will rise. Moreover, there would be downward pressure on the exchange rate and upward pressure on the prices paid by consumers. All Canadians stand to be affected. Now, the lower exchange rate may aid other exporters and make our imports more expensive, but nothing in the foreseeable future can replace the contribution of our energy sector to our current account. It is a far better scenario for Canada if oil prices firm up, our energy export revenue can be regained and indeed grow, our dependence on flows of foreign capital can be contained, our debt service costs remain low, the exchange rate stays firm, and prices stay low. And that, to my mind, is a sweet spot, at least part of the sweet spot. In short, it is in Canada's strong interest to have a healthy, viable energy, including oil and gas sector. This will be even more important as we go through, and hopefully by 2021 or so, as we emerge from this crisis. Now, is there a sweet spot where this industry is successful and Canada advances its environmental objectives, in particular, its contribution to the fight against global climate change? I think there is, and indeed there has to be. The oil and gas sector accounts for about 1/4 of total Canadian emissions of GHGs. While GHG intensity in the sector has come down materially because of rising supply, emissions in absolute terms have grown more than in any other sector since 2005. Clearly, the sector must be an important part of a climate change strategy for Canada. One cannot work around the sector. Working against the sector is defeatist economically. One must work with the sector. Now, critical questions, and I've worked with both the Conservative government and the Liberal government, right, at federal level. A critical question that governments, both Liberal and Conservatives, have chosen not to answer is what is the expectation for the oil and gas industry by way of environmental and emissions performance? And conversely, with some exceptions, and I had many conversations with a number of executives on this, and some recent pledges of net zero emissions by 2050, the oil and gas industry in Canada has hesitated to set out clear targets for its emissions performance. Neither party, governments or industry, has put cards on the table. The sweet spot has been elusive because it simply has never been defined. Now, the closest to a deal was the agreement between the NDP government of Rachel Notley and the large producers to cap total emissions from the oil sands at 100 megatons. The proposition is the following. A clear, ambitious set of goals is set. The industry takes up the challenge, willingly or less willingly, and it mobilizes. And then governments stand fully behind the industry. Governments have to set their expectations ex ante by way of regulation or some form of carbon price, and not ex post in the project review process where they become a moving target. If an ambitious target is set for the industry, it can mobilize, it can invest, and it can innovate. Canada can export more energy to the world with a lower intensity of emission than the competition. The industry will be making, as it is in part today, a critical economic contribution to Canada and an environmental and social contribution to a world that still needs oil and gas for some time in the period of transition. That is a sweet spot. To my mind, the foremost difficulty is developing a simple enough political narrative in support of this kind of construct that overcomes the simpler narratives on both sides of the spectrum. I'm a policy analyst and not a political scientist, so I'll stop here and let the conversation, first the other speakers and then the conversation take over. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Sarraj. That's a great start. And that opens the floor for Scott.
Great.
Scott, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks, Jeff and David. I'm really delighted to join Sarraj and Monica and the panel. So thanks to the IOG. So just go right to the sweet spot right away, and it'll resonate with some of the points I think Sarraj just very clearly laid out. So for me, the Sarraj spot is sort of an obvious one where it's looking at a convergence in this unprecedented crisis where you can find immediate job creation. You have public policy support of market structural shifts that are underway in markets now, and then the Paris decarbonization targets moving forward. And I think just to say, as another topic, I think I've been working quite a bit on debt loads, particularly in developing countries. So if we're concerned about Canada's debt loads, just thinking about how the developing countries are facing this is really time for another topic. But just going on those three ones. So first on jobs, And just to say how to get there, there's been a lot of really good work here in Canada and also internationally around a green economic rescue and green economic recovery. So let me first turn to jobs. There's been a lot of work now on pulling out some of the evidence from the 2008 Great Recession and how data is looking at what did green economic recovery do, particularly in immediate job creation. And I think the sort of takeaway is that those countries, there weren't a lot, but those countries that did make serious investments in green recovery generally had less unemployment shocks in the immediate term, and also had quicker rates of economic recovery compared to those countries that did not. So the big example is South Korea. It allocated more than 2/3 of its stimulus package on green measures, the highest proportion of any country. It dispersed those funds more quickly. It experienced smaller rates of unemployment at 2008, 2009, and it then raised higher rates of economic recovery compared to other OECD countries. So where there's a lot of sort of detailed data is in the United States, at their 2008, 2009 clean energy package under the Obama administration. I mean, that showed that under that package, it created 900,000 jobs. Spending on US public transit led to 70% more jobs than spending on highways, something that Canada did on shovel-ready projects. And its stimulus spending on coastal habitat restoration, one example of investments in natural capital, created more jobs than those created in fossil fuel investments. During the 2008-2009, 10 countries allocated stimulus spending on building energy efficiency, retrofits, green buildings, and again shows that those investments in job creation were really successful. And there's been really good work done here by Efficiency Canada on looking at similar trends and opportunities on demand side energy efficiency from the Canadian perspective. So those findings, and there's more, but those findings sort of underscore a report that was released in early May out of Oxford University. The co-authors had gained a lot of attention because Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize economist, was one of the co-authors with Nicholas Stern, the lead author of the Stern report, for those of you that follow that. And they similarly found, they went through an analysis of 700 past projects. And their sort of take-home message was that investments in clean energy, either particularly renewable energy, but also energy efficiency, generally created twice as many jobs as investment in fossil fuel sectors. So that's just a comparator on the job side. The second is just the structural shifts underway in markets now. And I think if you look back, past episodes of economic downturns have more or less coincided with a downturn in environmental policy ambition, certainly in climate policy ambition. And I think we may be seeing something different today for a bunch of different reasons. But just to give you a couple of sectoral examples. So the one is in transportation. I was on a call last week hosted by the Financial Times, and the CEO of Volvo, when asked when did he expect consumer demand to rebound, he said, well, I'm not sure, maybe 2021, but he said what he thought the big thing that was going to happen was that consumers weren't going to go back to combustion engines. Their demand was going to overwhelmingly be for electric automobiles. And you see now the announcement in France that came out just a couple of days. That's the French bet on economic recovery in their automotive sector, PSA and Renault. They're putting up 8 billion euros, and they say that money is going to go into two things. One is increase consumer demand for electric vehicles, and the second is increase research and development in hydrogen cars. And then what they're doing as an complementary infrastructure investment is to move up their targets to have 100,000 electric vehicle charging stations ready by the end of 2021. And I make the transportation point because this is a significant proportion of energy demand in all OECD countries, including Canada. And I think when we look post-COVID-19, the transportation energy may look very different than it does today. And we're seeing that similarly in renewable energy. I think examples from Denmark making significant investments, $37 billion in the largest offshore wind power project ever. And that is going to both be a job creator, but also to look at leading to their target of a 70% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. But I think what's really sort of interesting on sort of this market shift towards clean power is that it came out a report just a couple of days ago for the International Energy Agency, and they've reported that the renewable energy sector, sort of contrast, I think, Sarraj's layout of what's happened within oil and gas. They found that that those clean power stocks, the markets for particularly for renewable energy, have experienced a 2% increase in the first quarter of 2020, right in the middle of COVID-19, when there's been an unprecedented demand collapse. And that compares with an on average 40% decline in oil and gas stocks. The third one, which I won't go into, is just financial markets, but similarly, if you look now at a report that's come out, that those investors that have put their money behind ESG, behind environmental and social stocks, as it were, and companies, have outperformed the S&P 500 by a significant margin. So I'll just end by the third one, which is the decarbonization. And I couldn't agree more with Sarraj. I think that there needs to be clarity from all jurisdictions on what does a decarbonization pathway look like. So there was a letter that was signed by 200 CEOs yesterday to Prime Minister Boris Johnson in the UK, saying, we want to have a green recovery, which in itself is fairly extraordinary. But what they also said is, in those cases where there needs to be public money to support carbon intensive sectors like oil and gas, there should be what they called green strings or green conditions which are attached. And I think the International Monetary Fund has sort of laid out what those green conditions are. So it's not just from Canada wanting to have clarity. The IMF have said, in those cases where the economic bailouts should include bailout support for carbon intensive sectors, for oil and gas sectors, there should be clear plans towards decarbonization by mid-century net zero targets. And now we've seen that from the private sector, at least at the European side, from Total French, from BP, from Shell, saying, here's our plan to get from here to mid-century. There's discussion about how robust or inclusive or what the parameters of those plans are. But I end by saying that I think that if this is the advice coming from the IMF on having a green economic recovery, and also saying get an ex-ante plan in place that helps clarity with the sector and also can smooth out the transition and recovery. So I'll end there. Thanks, Dave.
Well, thank you, Scott. That's great. And I think that takes us to Monica.
Great. Thanks very much. David, is my audio about the right level?
Your audio, I think, is terrific, and your video is too.
Okay, terrific. That's great. Thank you so much for the opportunity to participate in this panel alongside Sarraj and Scott. It's a real honor and a privilege. My remarks are going to be drawing on research that you mentioned earlier, David. Thank you for the plug that we undertake at the University of Ottawa in an initiative called Positive Energy. So our mandate, as was mentioned, is to strengthen public confidence in energy decision making. And we do that in two ways, one of which is to use the convening power of the university to bring together leaders in the business, government, indigenous, environmental, NGO, and academic sectors. And the second of which is to undertake solution-focused applied academic research. So I lead a research team of about 24 researchers. So that work really brings us into contact with many of the leaders in the energy and environmental space. And I think one of the things I would kind of share with you on this front is that we have found over the last couple of years increasing levels of polarization and division. We see that not only to some degree in Canada. We have public opinion research that suggests that the fears of that or the concerns over that are perhaps overblown. But certainly within the kind of leader space of elite opinion and in the energy and environmental communities, there, we do see some pretty important divisions and some real divisions over this main question that's being posed here, which is, does a sweet spot exist? Stated another way, what is Canada's energy future in an age of climate change? And so my remarks are really going to focus in on this term transition that appears in the main question for our panel tonight. And, my answer to the question about a sweet spot is that, yes, I think there is room for optimism that a sweet spot exists, but I think there is much to be done, not only to identify what it is, but also to achieve it. And I'm going to lay out just a couple of thoughts on this, drawing on some research that we've completed recently around this term transition. Because one of the things, and again, because we are kind of in the center of an ecosystem of leaders in this space, we began to see that term itself was actually kind of polarizing and divisive. That rather than bringing people to the table, it was actually pushing people away from the table. So, being pointy-headed researchers, we thought, well, geez, why don't we do a research study and figure out what's going on here? So we undertook a research study where we interviewed more than 40 leaders in the energy and environmental space, and we asked them about this term. So, do your organizations use it? Do you use it? Is it helpful? And that in itself, the findings there were very interesting. Many folks saw the term as quite vague. They saw it as politicized. Some saw it as non-inclusive, sort of almost this idea that we're transitioning away from something to something else, and that, oil and gas isn't necessarily part of Canada's energy future from the perspective of some. So that in itself was interesting, but what really came out of this study for us that was, I think, quite fascinating and I would say important in terms of understanding where we're at politically on these issues in Canada, is that when we scratched, a little bit deeper, what we began to see is that many of the people that we were interviewing, and this was a pretty representative group of leaders, really occupied sort of one of two, what we refer to as realities in the transition or energy future space. And we call them realities because each of the folks on kind of both of those camps, so to speak, see themselves as realists. We would hear people say, if only we could have an honest conversation, if only people would face up to the facts. Well, sort of how people saw the facts and what conversations they qualified as honest were different. So these two realities, we just refer to them in the paper that is available on our website as reality 1 and reality 2, differ according to the scope that they see when it comes to transition and the pace of change in terms of energy systems. And quite notably, and I think both Sarraj and Scott pointed to this in their remarks, the place of oil and gas in the country's energy future. So reality 1, for those in this group, and again, none of the individuals that we interviewed necessarily fit, perfectly into either of these categories. They sort of leaned towards one or the other. And I think folks here will probably begin to see that you can see this reflected in our politics today. So for reality 1, transition for people in that reality, it's a measured process of change. It's focused on reducing GHG emissions, but it's focused on reducing GHG emissions through a diverse energy portfolio that includes renewable energy, that includes nuclear power, that includes, yes, oil and gas, but utilizing technologies like carbon capture. And in this reality, markets are really the major drivers of change, understood in the sense of sort of innovation and market forces to reduce emissions that then are supported by policy that isn't imposing excessive costs on industry or on individuals. So that's reality 1. Reality 2 sees transition as an urgent process rooted in the world facing a climate crisis. It nests scientifically derived climate targets within a much broader set of political and economic reforms related to energy. It does not see a future for oil and gas in Canada's energy mix and believes fossil fuels should be eliminated here in Canada as rapidly as possible. In this reality, policy is the main driver. And I think, this from our perspective, and certainly in the context of COVID has really, in my view, or in our view, shone a light, a very bright light on, existing debates and divisions in that sort of elite policy space. And I think we see, some evidence that those are actually, rather than COVID being something that leads towards greater unity, we're actually seeing it maybe leading towards sharper divisions between those in reality 1 and reality 2. So I started this presentation saying, there's room for optimism. I'm not sounding very optimistic at the moment. I will take that. But what I think it is really important here when it comes to moving forward on these realities is to try to identify, where can some bridges be built between them? Our research underscored a number of common areas of agreement. Everybody without exception agreed that climate change is happening. I think that's really important, particularly when you look to other countries where that isn't necessarily the case. Everyone agreed that Canada is in a transition of some sort and that more action is required. More climate action is required. I think this study also really points to the importance of language and terminology, right? It can bring people to the table or it can drive them apart. Everybody without exception agreed that Canada needs to reduce emissions, that emissions reduction is important. I think where there was disagreement or differences was on the pace and scope of change and where the oil and gas sector sits in that future. The other thing that came through as a potentially interesting place, and Sarraj, I think, alluded to this in some of his remarks, is distinguishing between the energy economies domestically and for export, right? So we see countries like Norway, for example, that undertake aggressive climate action at home, but that are continuing to sell into international markets, are continuing to develop their energy export economies. So there's something there that Canada could learn from in terms of thinking through how to find that sweet spot. What I think I would end on, and this is, I hope, a positive note, we can make progress in this country. I think one of the things that is underappreciated in terms of a major achievement was putting in place a carbon tax. I was in the States recently and mentioned that we have a carbon tax, and people were, astonished. These are folks in the energy sector who you would think would know, but they were astonished that Canada has a carbon tax. How did you manage to make that happen? Well, that didn't happen overnight. There was a long road to get there. The Alberta Climate Leadership Plan that Sarraj alluded to was part of that. There were multiple, federal and provincial and other initiatives that had to line up to make that happen. So progress is possible. But to come back to my kind of sub-theme here, and this is where I'll end, it's going to be hard won. There's much work to be done in this country to not only identify, what that sweet spot is, but how do we get there? I'll end on that note, David, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Monica. All three very interesting discussions. I think I'm supposed to be fed questions, but I don't actually see any questions. So I'm probably missing. I'm missing the stream. But maybe I could, so one thing I wanted to follow up with you on, Monica, was I actually missed, you talked about a term and I missed what that term was.
Transition, the term
transition.
transition.
Term.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. And so everybody seems to agree on that a sweet spot exists. One question I would have, and you've done a nice job, I think, in the divide there between reality 1 and reality 2, Monica. Can Canada meet its climate commitments with the oil and gas sector at its current state?
I think it depends which commitments that we're referring to. I mean, one of the things that concerns me right now, and I suspect my fellow panelists might have different views on this, so it could make for some interesting exchange. But that the drive towards 2030 and the focus on 2030 might actually be getting in the way of achieving things when it comes to 2050. You know, when you look at the scale of change that is going to be required in terms of reducing emissions, that is a relatively, it's a massive undertaking that both Sarraj and Scott pointed to some of the key sort of economic and technical aspects of that. One of the things that I think is underappreciated is the political aspects of that. We're a federation. We've got to have federal and provincial governments come together on, these huge files. And as we know, and this is, I'm sure you're going to want to let others in here, David, but as we know, the minute you talk about getting something built, and that thing could be a pipeline, or it could be a nuclear power plant, or it could be an electricity transmission line, or it could be a whole host of energy infrastructure that will be needed for us to reduce emissions in this country and change the GHG emissions profile of our sector. Immediately, you're getting into lengthy processes. You're getting into having to ensure that you've got communities on side, working with Indigenous communities, all of the various factors that we've seen so clearly coming out of a number of very controversial projects. And to do that between now and 2030, even for something like a large-scale hydro project, potentially difficult, if not impossible, to make happen. And my concern, to your question, my concern is that in this sort of rush for rapid action, that we might actually take one or maybe two steps forward and then quite a few steps backward as we get pushback if governments and others are trying to make change too quickly.
Thank you. Scott, did you want to come in?
No, I was told to turn on my video. I thought, you were giving me a command. So.
That's fine. I actually, Sarraj, I wonder if we might turn to you and ask what you think is preventing the plan that you referenced in your opening comments.
Well, again, I'm not sure it was necessarily a plan, because I didn't go into any of the details. This would be very tricky. And your question does bring it into light, in effect. I mean, can we actually do 2030, the 30% reduction with the kind of vibrancy in the oil and gas sector that would be expected in that part of the country, and again, to my mind, very much in Canada's interest. And it's a tough equation to make work. I mean, I was trying to go back today, although the website seems to have gone backward instead of forward. Environment Climate Change Canada does put out a pretty good accounting of where the emissions are by different sectors, what the projections are by 2030, what the gap is to the target, and so forth. One of the elephants in the room, and I didn't raise it because sometimes we don't want to talk about the elephant in the room, is if you give a bit more space for the oil and gas industry, then it's going to have to come from other places in the country to get back to your 2030 target, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And we never really, it's another issue that we never really kind of fully resolved. We established in the country a carbon price for political reasons, and I think good, valid political reasons, where all the income, the revenue go back to the provincial jurisdiction. That does not kind of optimize on a national basis your allocation of resources toward a particular outcome. It's a compromise kind of thing. So, but the other thing we don't have is we don't really have, okay, well, let's develop some scenarios. And we've had these conversations before with Monica. What does a scenario look like where we hit the target at a particular carbon price? What does that look like? What's the impact on, on emissions, on the economy, on sectoral allocation, and so forth? What happens? What's an alternative scenario where you say maybe 230 doesn't necessarily work, but we're lining up for a longer term kind of, achievement of a more ambitious target with a bit more time. What does that give you? Again, we debate these things without necessarily a lot of the evidence, a lot of the quantified type of analysis that would allow to say, yeah, we actually prefer scenario A to scenario B. Scott was raising that perhaps, there are some scenarios that could be put forward that where there's a promise of greater jobs and so forth. Okay, well let's put these kinds of scenarios to the test versus another one where there's more room given to the oil and gas sector, for example. Let's have the good conversation. But we don't really have these things on the table right now.
Right. And Scott, you referenced smart investments, if you like, take advantage of the crisis we have now and make the investments in green. In your assessment, do we have the right structures in place to do that sensibly?
It's a great question. What I would say, Ministers Morneau and McKenna had convened the task force on sustainable finance. I think the task force's report of June 2019 was actually really good. There was some really good, really concrete suggestions on how Canada's financial sector can pivot towards green investments. What I would say is I think we have both the luxury and the curse of living next to our neighbors, and we see this in full spades, in the last 48 hours or this week. And I think Wall Street is nowhere near, I think, where some European financial markets are. The UK being one, the European Commission looking at how to green financial markets as another. So I think that this is an area of particular risk to the Canadian financial sector is that its exposure in the energy sector more broadly. And this brings me to a point that Sarraj made, and just to say I couldn't agree more. The role of scenarios is I think now really important. We're going into a future which has no precedent. So we don't have any past in order to refer to. And I thought it was really interesting. So the Bank of International Settlements, which is kind of the banker's bank based in Basel, Switzerland, is among the most conservative of any international institutions. It makes the International Monetary Fund look like Greenpeace. They came out with a report in January 2020 called Green Swan. And they looked at climate risk, and what they've said very clearly, based on the science that Monica, I was glad referenced, was that based on climate risk, all assets in all financial markets are now at risk. And what they said is there's a particular, now an unknown cascading risk, what they called a whiplash effect, of how stranded assets and other risks are going to become magnified because of climate change. And so what they concluded was all their risk models that they rely on, which is their daily business, day in, day out, to quantify financial risks that banks and private sector face, they've said our quantitative models are ill-equipped to understand the future that climate poses. And so what their big conclusion is that we need to rely more on scenarios and foresight analysis in order to tease through different potential outcomes and then help to guide public policy towards those scenario outcomes. And I think that was January, which now seems like a different era, because what international markets and Canada have gone through in the last 3 months, to me, just magnifies or underscores that need to say, we don't know where we are, we don't know where we're going, and our models sure aren't going to help us. And so let's look at different models, and scenarios, I think, are one.
And the climate risk speaks to Sarraj's point on the financial side as well.
Well, absolutely. I think it's I got my head taken off by Sarraj at a an internal discussion. I think right. But I mean, I think that there are different groups that are tracking, which banks around the world hold carbon assets, and generally, JP Morgan is the world's leading one on fossil fuel loans and investments, but Canadian banks are right in that top 10 list, and regardless of the language of this, what I think it just does expose, which is why I think the Basel Bank did the report, is that, and Mark Carney and the FSB and others, to say, look, these are now risks which actually may not go in a linear fashion. So they actually may, the risk which financial markets generally think of as linear risk is actually may have cascading effects, which actually may create far greater exposure than we see right now. So that is indeed Sarraj's point. But I think Sarraj's other point is that Canada may be proportionally at greater risk because of the importance of the oil and gas sector in its capital accounts and export earnings, et cetera. So I think this sort of underscores Monica's point, and I think this is where her work is trying to say, what we don't want to have is a dialogue of the deaf. And I think the only other point I just make on this is that I think it's really important, particularly looking at the experience of the European Union, is to treat all regions the same. Is that if you actually discriminate regional recovery, rescue and recovery, you now have an amplification. You're seeing it in Italy, you see it in Spain, you see it in Germany, you see it elsewhere, that those that wanted to leave the European Union before COVID-19 want to leave even more urgently now because they feel unfairly treated. And I think Canada really needs to be careful that we're not going to, to use an expression from our school days, you don't want to kick someone when they're down. So I think it's really important to have equal treatment, but also clear treatment on the rescue and recovery plans.
Thank you. One of the questions from our audience is really an extension of the one that I had asked you, Scott, which is, do we have the right energy policy structures at the federal level? Or said another way, what might we be doing differently as we think about federal energy policy? And so maybe, Monica, maybe we would start that with you, but I'm sure each of our panelists would be able to say something about that.
Sure, thanks, David. And I guess whenever I hear the expression federal energy policy, the energy analyst in me says, what are you talking about? Energy is predominantly within the hands of the provinces. And that, again, brings us back to one of the, wonderfully challenging things about this country. So, but to answer the question, I think it is important to think about, okay, so what are the levers that are in the federal government's hands? And there's certainly going to be a lot of looking to the federal government for obvious reasons on spending. As we well know, the resources there are, at least in theory, more plentiful. I don't even know if I can use that word at this point in time, but relatively more accessible than at the provincial level and municipal level, shall we say. But I think the other thing too, that the federal government, in terms of role in energy, is that it can play an important role in terms of that executive federalism piece, or that intergovernmental relations piece. And the current government, prior to COVID, had a substantial effort underway to try to rebuild bridges to the West. I think that was extremely important. I think one of the challenges that we've seen, and again, it's political, but it then filters into policy, is the partisan polarization. The partisan polarization around many of these issues. The federal government could potentially, have the ability to exercise some leadership and reach across partisan divides. And there, I would think less within Parliament and more between federal and provincial governments reaching out to provincial governments, because that's one of the biggest obstacles, I would say, right now in terms of reality one and reality two, is that they've begun to become associated with partisan politics. And then how do you have Sarraj's evidence-based conversation and analysis, and Scott's, and I couldn't agree more, scenarios-based, thinking about the future in an environment that's highly partisan. So I think the federal government can play a very strong role in terms of setting that tone. And of course, it's also got, again, on the policy side, it's got levers in terms of international trade, in terms of interprovincial commerce, obviously in the areas of the environment as well. Somebody asked a question around reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, in the areas of infrastructure. There's a whole host of tools at its disposal. But I think it's about getting that, that balance. And I know balance isn't a terribly fashionable term at the moment, but getting that balance, right, a workable balance that doesn't tear the country apart.
Sarraj, have you got a view on this?
Yeah, I want to come back a bit to the issue that Scott raised, which is a really important issue on the capital side of the equation here, in terms of certainly the movement of institutional investors to want to manage the risk and climate-related risk. It's one reason why I think, governments in our industry really do need to come together, because other people are going to come together for them, if we don't start charting a path. And decisions are quite easy to make for an institutional investor in some kind of boardroom in Zurich or in Paris, maybe New York. We have to internalize quite a few kind of variables in those kinds of choices. But I think we want to put forward the very best that we can do as Canada in basically putting out the standards out there, not essentially not being defensive about it, and not waiting for Larry Fink to decide that he's going to move a greater part of his portfolio outside of anything having to do with Canada's oil and gas sector. So how do we, I really liked Monica's analogy to Norway. How do we become more of the Norway? And again, and Monica mentioned in that, which is really important, the distinction we need to make between the way we use energy domestically and how we can still, sell, and I think Scott acknowledges as well, sell, in an export market, and do so, again, at very high standards in terms of climate emissions. We got work to do still, mind you. And in terms of ESG, where I think it's kind of a slam dunk for us on a wider kind of basis. But, it is a bit frustrating when you're sitting here and you find that there may be some institutional investor just decide to just take a swipe and to say, well, no, it's not going to be Canada because, it's kind of oil sands, whatever else. Well, I mean, what is the right, and, I would hope Mark Carney continues to work on this. What are the real kind of, disclosure standards for climate related risks? How do we manage them? How do we actually put forward a proposition where we're serious about managing those risks, about bringing emissions down, and we're going to be best in class? And, it's going to be others who are not taking initiative who are going to suffer. But, we're going to, we ought not be defensive about this. We'd actually have to step up.
Scott?
Yeah, I mean, I think both Sarraj and Monica have answered. I mean, I think we live in a federation, and you see now this has become. I mean, I never would have imagined that a discussion over a pipeline has created a potentially constitutional crisis in the country. But I think it does underscore that the energy discussions have become even more polarized. And I think Monica's point is, what will it look like at the other end of this crisis, and what can Ottawa do? And I think Sarah should mention, I mean, clearly on the fiscal policy side, the carbon pricing, really welcome. It was a long slog, and now it's there, and hopefully it's going to become outside of political changes in political leadership, and other countries have arrived at that. I mean, there's other things that Ottawa can do. Procurement and infrastructure spending are real big ones on federal provincial transfers, and I think the last one that I think both have just mentioned is the trade issue. As a plug, I just did something on policy options a couple of days ago, and part of this is we think about Canada's energy policy really around oil and gas, and that should be part of it, but it's kind of Obama's all of the above. It's, it's carbon capture and storage, it's nuclear, but it's also looking at how does a transition in a market create new opportunities for Canada's natural resource sector. And I think part of that is looking, if you look at the increase of renewable energy and photovoltaics and others, that's made with stuff. And Canada, as a big natural resource economy exporter, can actually provide the materials, the metals, and the mining materials that are actually indispensable in this transition towards sort of cleaner energy. So there are other jobs outside of Fort McMurray and Labrador, which are also incredibly important for Canada's energy strategy. But right now, the mistrust, I think, is why Monica's work is so important, because if nothing, we're getting even more distance, I think, during this crisis. And we heard, I think, things like, oil and gas are dead. And I think that kind of language at this particular critical moment when jobs are collapsing and the market is collapsing, others, I mean, that's not really helpful to say this is not the dialogue that we want to have to build a national effort on what does a new energy policy look like, and what is the role of conventional energy in this transition.
Thank you. So we've got 3 or 4 minutes left, maybe some closing thoughts. Sarraj, why don't we talk with you? You started out in an optimistic tone, but.
Well, I always try to be optimistic. I should perhaps beg forgiveness of Scott if ever I had a moment where I might have been brutal. It's from the fact that he used to be my auditor when I was at Natural Resource Canada. So at some point I kind of had to get even. Although he was kind of gentle as an auditor, I should say. But I do want to. There was not a bad article by Chris Reagan. I forget the co-author the other day, who cautioned a bit against the. One could easily think about a government, perhaps this federal government. Okay, we're going to have a green recovery kind of budget, and it's going to have like a list of 60 kind of things. And we're going to spend a fair amount of money. We're going to do a lot of stuff. And what one asks then is, what are the anchors for that in terms of, okay, well, if you had a benchmark kind of carbon price, how does that measure against the carbon price, right? So how many emissions are you going to get at what price for that particular measure? And I think that the more we can have a carbon price, not just be something that people pay, but something that becomes a measure of the policies that are work and the policies that don't. And even if you have to work on a shadow kind of carbon price because the market cannot necessarily bear it right now, but work with a shadow carbon price to at least filter some of these different policies, including anything in oil and gas, by the way, including carbon capture and sequestration, which last time I checked is not cheap, right? Let's make sure that if we invest broadly in a number of these areas, we have at least some kind of benchmarks to ensure that we're doing it sensibly.
Thank you, Scott.
Yeah, I mean, thanks very much. I wish we had more time actually, but just to say that I think one of the obvious reasons that we're talking about this is just because of the climate science that Monica had mentioned. And I think, the data that's come out from 2019, the World Meteorological Organization just released a report, in 2019, we're now at 1.1 degrees Celsius global warming. So the space we have to keep within looking at a new escalating sense of risk is very, very small. So I think we've been talking about this in Canada now for quite a long time. And this, opportunity is the wrong word, but I think the COVID-19 global crisis creates an opportunity to reset that trajectory of leading towards a world which none of us and none of our children want to live in. And so just within that, I think that the science, whether we like it or not, is the reference point for why the markets, why BlackRock and others are shifting, why Goldman's is shifting. And it's because that science is so compelling and unforgiving that Canada will either move in order to respond, or it will face even deeper risk, both economically as well as ecologically. So thank you.
Thank you. And that leaves you, Monica. I was troubled, I have to say, to hear the result on COVID-19 and that it was dividing rather than uniting, at least in the energy and climate space. But,
well, and it's interesting that you should start there, because that's actually where I was going to go. Is that although and when that comment was in reference to what, losing a headphone here, in reference to sort of how we've observed the debate evolving since the onset of COVID-19. Scott mentioned the oil is dead comment. We're not necessarily seeing people coming together on the issue so much as, potentially becoming more distant from one another. That said, that's on the sort of, partisan level. It's on the, sort of decision maker, energy and environmental leader level. The public opinion survey research that we've undertaken, and we have not undertaken a wave during COVID-19. So what I'm referring to is pre-COVID-19. We'll have to see how things evolve. But we've got about 5 years of data now. And, what we see there is much more, Canadians being really quite pragmatic on these issues, and very much wanting to see governments, do the right thing by the climate, and do the right thing as well in terms of, supporting oil and gas development, but done in an environmentally responsible way. Where they're a little less confident is in government's, performance on that front, but they remain optimistic. So I think, that to me is actually quite positive, that there's some, ongoing support and optimism in terms of Canada being able to get this right. I think then it becomes up to leaders and governments, including folks here today, to make that happen.
well, that's a nice way to end it. I think, Jeff, this brings us to the end, I think. I would like to thank each of our panelists. I'd like the panelists to imagine loud applause and wonderful gifts. But that'll be for another day. So
Thank you, Dave.
Jeff, to you.
Yeah, thanks, David. And again, a huge thanks to all of our panelists for a very rich discussion this evening. But actually, the evening's not over. If you would like to continue the